She had just wrapped up another long day at work, a day that stretched far beyond the hours she had planned. The crisp air of early evening greeted her as she stepped out of the office building, feeling a slight relief that the day was finally over. The streets were still busy with people hurrying home or heading out for their evening routines, and the city buzzed with the usual hum of life. But for her, there was something about this moment that felt different, something about the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Her name wasn't known by the public, and that was intentional. In her line of work, secrecy was everything. To the outside world, she was just another woman walking down the street. But in truth, she was an FBI agent, a fact that would soon play a crucial role in what was about to unfold. She made her way through the familiar streets of a neighborhood that had always been known for its racial tension and community unrest. It wasn't the most welcoming place, but she had been here before countless times. This wasn't her neighborhood, but her job sometimes brought her to places where danger lurked just beneath the surface. As she walked, her mind wandered over the events of the day, cases, paperwork, meetings, but her thoughts were abruptly interrupted when she heard the sound of footsteps behind her, growing louder and closer. She glanced over her shoulder and saw 2 police officers walking in her direction. Their eyes were fixed on her. There was something about the way they were walking, something that felt off. For a moment, she tried to ignore the feeling of unease creeping up her spine. She wasn't one to get nervous easily, especially not in situations like this. But this was different. It wasn't just their presence that felt wrong, but the way they seemed to be focusing solely on her. The officers closed the distance quickly, and before she knew it, one of them was standing in front of her, blocking her path. The other took a position behind her as if to trap her in place. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer in front of her said, his tone demanding. "We need to ask you some questions." She had seen this kind of thing before, police officers questioning someone for no apparent reason other than their own assumptions. It wasn't unusual for people of color to be stopped and questioned in this neighborhood, even when they were doing nothing wrong, but she had learned to stay calm in these situations. She knew how to handle herself. She took a deep breath and looked the officer in the eye. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady but firm. The officer didn't respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at his partner, then back at her. "We've had reports of someone matching your description causing trouble around here. You fit the profile. We need to check you out." She could feel the adrenaline beginning to rise. The suspicion in the officer's eyes was palpable, and she knew that the situation could escalate if she wasn't careful. But she wasn't about to back down. She'd faced much worse than this in her career as an agent, and she was trained to stay composed in even the most tense situations. "I'm not involved in any trouble," she said, trying to keep her voice calm. "I'm just heading home." The officer's expression hardened. "You need to come with us now." Before she could react, the second officer stepped closer, reaching for her arm as if to pull her toward him. She instinctively took a step back, her body tense. She knew that if she allowed them to touch her, things would get worse fast. The last thing she wanted was for them to escalate the situation by making her appear as though she was resisting arrest. "I said I'm just walking home," she repeated, now a little sharper. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officers weren't listening. The first officer stepped toward her, his hand still outstretched, and that's when she felt the first sharp pain, a baton striking her in the side. She gasped, not expecting the blow. It wasn't hard enough to knock her down, but it was enough to get her attention. The officer swung again, this time hitting her on the arm. The pain was jarring, and it sent a rush of heat through her body. But she didn't move. She didn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. Her mind raced as she quickly assessed her options. She had been trained for this, but nothing could fully prepare her for the shock of being attacked in this way, by the very people who were supposed to protect the public. Her training as an FBI agent had taught her how to deal with threats, but this was different. This wasn't just a suspect trying to get away. This was police brutality, raw and real. Her heart pounded as she shifted her stance, ready to fight back if necessary. She had to protect herself. She couldn't let them get away with this. But she also knew she had to stay in control. The last thing she wanted was for things to get even more out of hand. But the baton kept coming, hitting her with more force each time. She was growing more and more frustrated with the situation. She knew she couldn't just stand there and take it. "Stop," she shouted, trying to make them understand. "I'm FBI. I'm an agent. But the officers didn't seem to care. They were too far gone in their prejudice, too clouded by whatever assumptions they had made about her. One of them grunted, tightening his grip on the baton, and swung again. It was then that something inside her snapped. In one swift motion, she dodged the blow, grabbed the officer's wrist, and twisted. The baton fell from his hand with a loud clatter, and she stepped back, putting some distance between them. The shock on their faces was immediate. They hadn't expected that. I said stop, she repeated, her voice now full of authority. She pulled out her badge, holding it up for them to see. The look in their eyes shifted for a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing their faces. They had no idea who they were dealing with. But the damage had already been done. The sound of the baton clattering against the pavement echoed through the otherwise quiet street. She kept her eyes locked on the two officers, her heart still racing but her mind sharp. She had always prided herself on staying composed no matter what, and this was no different. But she could feel the heat rising in her chest as the adrenaline surged. The officers looked at each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to anger. For a brief moment, they seemed unsure of what to do next. She had made the mistake of underestimating just how far they were willing to push things. One of the officers was the first to recover from the shock of having his weapon disarmed. He stepped forward, fists clenched, ready to make a move. The look in his eyes told her everything she needed to know. He didn't care who she was. He didn't care that she was FBI. All that mattered to him was that she had stood up to him, and now he wanted to make her pay for it. Get down on the ground, he barked, his voice harsh and full of command. She didn't move. She stood her ground, but her mind was racing. The last thing she wanted was a physical confrontation with two officers, especially in a neighborhood where things could spiral out of control quickly. But she knew she couldn't back down. Not now. If she did, they would see it as weakness. They would use it against her. I've told you, I'm with the FBI, she repeated, louder this time, showing her badge again. You're making a mistake. I'm just trying to get home. The second officer, the one who had been standing behind her earlier, now stepped forward. He had a scowl on his face, but he didn't reach for his baton again. Instead, he began to circle around her, sizing her up as if he was trying to figure out her next move. The first officer didn't look any less furious, but at least he wasn't rushing in blindly now. They were both still tense, their hands hovering near their holsters, ready to draw their weapons if they felt the need. For a moment, everything stood still. She was aware of every passing second, every breath she took. The city's noise felt miles away. It was just her, the two officers, and the uncertainty of what was going to happen next. She knew that no matter what, she couldn't let them overpower her. But she also couldn't escalate things further. That would be exactly what they wanted. Show me your ID, the first officer demanded, his voice cold and firm. Now, she shook her head slowly, still maintaining eye contact. I've shown you my badge. You can call it in. I'm telling you the truth. The officer's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Instead, he grabbed his radio, his fingers hovering over the buttons. She stood there, the seconds dragging on. The radio crackled with static before he finally spoke into it, his voice sharp. We've got a possible 1056 here. Need backup. Code 3. She took a step back, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her. She knew what was coming next. More officers would be arriving, and the situation would only get more complicated. She could already feel the anger rising in the pit of her stomach. It wasn't just about the physical assault anymore. It was about the blatant injustice, the racial profiling, the assumption that because of her appearance, she was somehow guilty of something. Her grip tightened around her badge as she weighed her options. Should she try to push further? Demand that they take her seriously? Or should she wait for backup to arrive and try to explain everything to the higher-ups? Neither option was ideal. If she demanded too much, it could end in a full-blown confrontation. But if she let them take control, it would make it harder for her to prove what had happened. She had to find a way to stay in control, to make them see that she wasn't just another person they could push around. Don't make this harder than it has to be, the second officer muttered, as though speaking to himself. But she could hear the threat in his tone, the insinuation that they could do more than just question her if they wanted to. It was a chilling thought, especially considering the way he had already threatened to take her down. But she couldn't back down. I'm not resisting you, she said, her voice firm but calm. But I need you to understand I'm an FBI agent. I'm not just some random person on the street. You're making a mistake. The first officer gave her a long, hard stare. She could feel his eyes sizing her up, trying to figure out whether she was lying. There was doubt there, no doubt about it. But there was also something else in his gaze, something more unsettling. It wasn't just disbelief anymore. It was disdain. She could see it in the way he tilted his head slightly, the way his lips curled ever so slightly at the corners. It wasn't just about the fact that she was a woman, or the fact that she was an agent. It was about the fact that she was a woman of color, and she could see how that fact alone made them uncomfortable. They hadn't expected her to be who she was. They hadn't expected someone like her to fight back. She swallowed hard, trying to push aside the frustration building up inside of her. She had to remain calm, had to remember her training. It was in moments like this that the ability to stay calm was the difference between escalating things or keeping them under control. "I'm not going anywhere," she said finally, her voice unwavering. "You can call whoever you want, but I'm not leaving here until this is sorted out." The first officer's hand tightened around his radio, but before he could respond, the unmistakable sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. Her heart sank slightly. More officers, more questions, more eyes on her. She had always known that her job as an agent meant dealing with dangerous situations, but she never imagined it would escalate like this, especially not when she was just trying to walk home after a long day. The idea that her very presence, her identity, would be questioned, ridiculed, and assaulted like this felt like a violation in and of itself. But she had no choice now but to stand her ground. She had already taken the first step by showing them who she was. Now it was time to make sure they didn't walk all over her. Her thoughts were interrupted when a patrol car screeched to a stop nearby. 2 more officers stepped out, their eyes scanning the situation quickly. One of them was a woman, her expression unreadable. The other, a man, looked furious. He took one look at the scene and immediately strode toward the first officer. "What's going on here?" the woman officer asked sharply. "This woman is resisting arrest. We have a 1056 situation," the first officer said, his voice tight. The woman officer looked at the girl, then back at the 2 men. "You're an FBI agent?" she asked, her tone softer now. The girl nodded, her heart pounding as she felt the weight of her situation settling in once more. "Yes, I've shown you my badge already." The woman officer took a step back, her hand hovering near her radio. The man, however, took another step forward, still skeptical. "I think we need to get this sorted out quickly," the woman officer said, her gaze narrowing on the 2 men. "You might have made a mistake." The moment the woman officer spoke, everything shifted. It was as if the air in the street had thickened, the tension now hanging heavier than ever. The girl could feel the weight of her badge in her pocket, the symbol of the authority she had tried to assert moments before, now more important than ever. She knew that it wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the system, about how this moment was going to play out and what it would mean for both her and the officers. The 2 men seemed to hesitate, their confusion now obvious. They had expected a confrontation, expected the girl to break under pressure, but what they had gotten instead was a defiance they hadn't anticipated. This wasn't just any woman they were trying to intimidate. She was someone who knew the law, someone who had the power to fight back, and they weren't sure how to handle that. The woman officer looked at the first man, then at the second. "I think we need to call this in. Something doesn't feel right about this whole situation," she said, her voice firm but calm. The woman's words didn't just cut through the tension, they cut through the doubt in the air, and for the first time the officers had to reconsider the situation. But it wasn't enough. The girl's heart was still racing, and she knew they needed more than just words. She needed them to understand that she wasn't just another victim of mistaken identity, another casualty of racial profiling. She was an agent of the law, and she had every right to be standing there without being treated like a criminal. She wasn't going to let them strip her of that right. The second officer, the one who had been circling her earlier, finally spoke up, his voice dripping with skepticism. "I don't know, Lisa, this doesn't seem right. She could be lying for all we know. Who's to say she's really FBI?" The woman officer, now clearly named Lisa, turned to face him, her eyes narrowing. "Are you seriously going to sit here and tell me that you believe she's lying? Do you think someone would risk everything, risk their career just to make something up like this?" For a moment the man was silent, his gaze shifting from Lisa to the girl. His skepticism was thick, but he was beginning to realize that he might be wrong. The girl could feel the shift, but she wasn't about to let her guard down just yet. She had been in situations before where things changed in an instant, where an apology meant nothing when the damage had already been done. Lisa, noticing the man's hesitation, turned back to the girl. "Show me your badge again," she said, her voice softer now. It wasn't a demand this time, but an attempt to verify her story. The girl took a deep breath, knowing what she had to do. Slowly, she reached into her jacket and pulled out her badge, holding it up for Lisa to see. She wasn't just showing it to her. She was showing it to everyone present. She wanted the officers to understand that she wasn't some random person they could push around. She was part of the system they swore to uphold. Lisa glanced at the badge and then back at the girl. "All right," she said, her tone now more neutral. "I believe you. I'm sorry this happened." She didn't offer an apology for the Baton strike, but the girl could tell there was genuine remorse in Lisa's voice. Lisa understood that something had gone terribly wrong, but the first officer, still not convinced, took a step forward. "We still need to sort this out," he said, his voice insistent. She shouldn't have resisted arrest. The girl took a step back, her patience wearing thin. "I wasn't resisting arrest. I was trying to explain who I am, and you attacked me without cause. You made an assumption, and now you're paying for it." She didn't raise her voice, but every word she spoke was heavy with the weight of her frustration. Lisa looked at the first officer, clearly irritated by his persistence. "I don't think that's how this happened, and I'm not going to let you keep pushing this. We're calling this in, and I'm reporting what happened here. You've messed up, and we need to figure out how to handle this." The first officer's face reddened. He didn't want to admit he had made a mistake, didn't want to be the one responsible for causing a scene. But deep down he knew she was right. He had overstepped. He had let his prejudices cloud his judgment, and now he was on the verge of making things worse. "I don't need to be lectured," he spat, his frustration clear. "She's still a threat." Lisa shook her head, her patience thinning. "No, she's not. And if you keep acting like this, you're going to make things worse for yourself. We're getting backup, and I'm getting a report filed. You're done here." The first officer glared at her, his pride wounded, but he didn't argue further. Instead, he pulled out his radio again, this time to call for more officers. The girl could feel the tension in the air shift again as the other officers arrived. She could hear the sirens getting louder as they approached. But this time, it wasn't just more police showing up to make things more complicated. This time, it was the right kind of backup. Backup that would listen to what had happened, that would make sure the truth came out. As the second patrol car screeched to a stop, more officers climbed out. The girl kept her stance firm, her mind racing with the possibilities of what could happen next. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about what would happen after. She wasn't going to let this be swept under the rug. Not this time. The new officers, all of them older, more experienced, quickly assessed the situation. One of them, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor, stepped toward Lisa. He seemed to understand what had just transpired without needing an explanation. He glanced over at the girl, his eyes scanning her, but not in the way the other officers had done. He wasn't sizing her up. He wasn't judging her. He was listening. "I'll handle this," the older officer said to Lisa. "You stay back." Lisa nodded, and for the first time, the girl felt like someone was finally treating her with the respect she deserved. She didn't need the apology. She just needed someone to understand, someone to see that she wasn't just a statistic, a number, or a face in a crowd. She was a person. The older officer turned to her, his expression softening. "I'm sorry about what happened," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "This should never have gone this far. We'll make sure it gets taken care of." The girl nodded, trying to contain the emotion building up inside of her. She hadn't expected an apology, but it was clear that this officer understood the gravity of what had happened. He wasn't just interested in stopping the scene from getting bigger. He was interested in making things right. "I just want to go home," she said, her voice steady but tired. The older officer gave her a nod. "I understand, you will. We'll take it from here." The two officers who had initially stopped her stood off to the side, their postures a little less confident than they had been before. The damage was done. The girl had stood her ground, and she had forced them to confront their own mistakes. As the older officer began making calls to report the incident, the girl took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had stood up for herself, for what was right, and for the countless others who had faced situations like this. But she also knew that the work was far from over. This wasn't just about her. This wasn't just one moment. It was a wake-up call for the system. A reminder that no one should be judged based on their appearance. No one should be attacked without reason. She was an agent, but she was also a human being, and that was what mattered most in that moment. The air around her was still heavy, filled with the tense silence that only comes after a storm has passed. But before the aftermath is fully understood, she stood there watching as the older officer spoke into his radio, taking charge of the situation. For the first time that evening, she felt a flicker of relief, though it was small, barely enough to quiet the frustration that still churned within her. The sirens had stopped, but the sounds of the city continued to buzz around her, indifferent to what had just unfolded. She didn't know what would happen next. Would they believe her? Would this just be brushed aside? Like so many other incidents of abuse by those in power? She wasn't sure, but she couldn't allow herself to become another statistic. She had to stay strong. The older officer finished his call and turned to her, his demeanor calm but serious. "We're going to make sure everything is handled properly from here on out. You've been through a lot, and we're going to get to the bottom of this." Her heart slowed slightly at his words, but there was still a lingering doubt. The words sounded reassuring, but actions spoke louder than promises. She had been through enough situations where the right things were said, but not enough was done. "Thank you," she said, her voice steady but tired. I don't want this to happen to anyone else. It can't keep going on like this." He nodded, his expression softening. "We're with you on that. It shouldn't have happened, and we're going to make sure it doesn't again. But we need to make sure the report is accurate. We need your side of the story, everything that happened from your perspective." The girl took a deep breath, trying to gather her thoughts. She had replayed the events over and over in her mind, but now that she had to speak about them, it felt like the weight of it all was threatening to crush her. She had stood up for herself, yes, but the emotional toll was something she wasn't sure she had fully processed yet. It wasn't just about the physical assault. It was the deeper hurt, the sense of being seen as less than human, the assumption that because of her appearance, she was guilty of something she hadn't even done. "I understand," she said, her voice quieter now. "It's just, I don't know how to explain what happened. I was just walking home. I didn't do anything wrong." The officer nodded, not interrupting, letting her speak at her own pace. "Take your time. We'll make sure this is done the right way." She took a slow, steadying breath and began to recount the events. She told him about the officers stopping her, about how they had approached her aggressively from the start. She spoke about the Baton strike, how she hadn't expected it, how it had caught her off guard and filled her with a mix of confusion and anger. But she also made sure to tell him about the moment she had stood her ground, when she had revealed who she was, when she had shown them her badge and expected them to listen. "I thought that would be enough," she continued. "I thought showing them my badge would make them stop, but it didn't. They just kept going. It felt like they didn't care who I was. They just saw a woman of color, and that was enough for them to treat me like I wasn't even human." The older officer's face tightened, the muscles in his jaw working as he listened. He didn't say anything at first, letting her finish her story. When she was done, he let out a breath, his eyes meeting hers. "I'm sorry that happened to you," he said softly. "No one should ever feel like that, especially not someone who's out here trying to make the world better, doing their job. We're going to make sure this is looked into, but for now I need you to stay calm. There's still a lot to sort out." She nodded, trying to push down the overwhelming sense of exhaustion that was creeping over her. The emotions were raw, but she had to stay focused. There were bigger things at stake now. The incident wasn't just about her. It was about the bigger picture, the issues of systemic racism, the misuse of power, and how it affected people every day. "Everywhere, I know," she said, her voice a little quieter now. "I just don't know what will happen next. Will they believe me? Will this get swept under the rug like all the others?" He placed a hand on her shoulder, a gesture that felt comforting yet so small in the face of the issues at hand. "You've got people on your side now, and we're not going to let this go. We'll investigate it properly. Make sure the officers are held accountable. It won't be ignored." It was the reassurance she needed, though a small part of her was still unsure. She had seen how quickly things could go wrong, how easily the truth could get lost in a sea of lies and cover-ups. But for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this would be different. The sound of footsteps behind her caught her attention, and she turned to see two more officers approaching. One of them was another woman, her expression neutral, while the other was a tall man with a serious look on his face. They both stopped a few feet away, waiting for the older officer to speak. "This is Officer Moore," he said, nodding toward the woman. "And Officer Daniels." He looked back at her. "They're here to make sure we get all the details. We're going to file a full report on what happened." Officer Moore stepped forward, her voice kind and professional. "We understand what you've been through, and we want to make sure everything is done by the book. If there's anything you need, anything you remember that could help with the investigation, we're here." The girl nodded, feeling a slight weight lift from her shoulders. She was beginning to realize that this wasn't going to be as easy as walking away. There would be follow-up, there would be reports, and there would be a long process ahead. But at least she wasn't alone in it anymore. "Thank you," she said softly. "I just want to make sure this doesn't happen again." To me or anyone else, Officer Daniels, who had been standing silently, finally spoke. "We're going to make sure of that. You've got our word. This will be thoroughly investigated." The girl's thoughts were interrupted when she heard the distant sound of an approaching siren once more. This time a vehicle pulling into the area. She turned toward the noise, feeling her muscles tense as she wondered what more this situation would bring. Would more officers come? Were they here to make things even more complicated? But as the car pulled up and the doors opened, she was surprised to see a familiar face. It was the police chief, stepping out of the vehicle with a look of concern on his face. He was an older man, his uniform impeccably neat, and his expression was far from the hardened indifference she had come to expect from some of the officers. His eyes scanned the scene, then landed on her. "Is everything all right here?" he asked, his voice steady but not unkind. Officer Moore nodded. "We're handling it, Chief. The situation is under control." The chief turned his gaze to the girl, his eyes studying her for a moment. "I've heard about what happened. I want to apologize for what you've had to go through. This should never have happened." The girl's breath caught for a moment, surprised by his words. She wasn't expecting an apology from the chief, but hearing him say it felt like a small victory. It wasn't enough to erase the pain of the evening, but it was a start. "Thank you," she said, her voice still soft but steady. "I just want to make sure that this doesn't get ignored, that it's not just forgotten." He nodded, his expression serious. "We're taking this very seriously. I'll make sure the right steps are taken. You have my word." As the conversation continued, the girl allowed herself a moment of quiet relief. The officers involved in the incident were starting to realize the severity of their actions. The police chief's involvement meant the incident would no longer be something that could be swept under the rug. But she also knew this was only the beginning. There would be more steps to take, more people to hold accountable, and more battles to fight. The evening was far from over, but for the first time she felt like she was on the right side of history. The days following the incident felt like a blur. She had barely slept, the adrenaline from that night still pumping through her veins, leaving her restless and uneasy. But as the investigation began, she knew she couldn't stop. She couldn't allow herself to be complacent. There were too many people counting on her, people who didn't have the means to stand up for themselves the way she had. The officers who had first approached her were placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. She had seen it all too many times before. Officers involved in misconduct were often given a temporary break, only to return with no real consequences. She didn't want to assume the worst, but she couldn't help but feel a familiar sense of skepticism creeping in. Still, she kept moving forward. The days blurred together as meetings, paperwork, and interviews piled up. She had to recount the story over and over to investigators, making sure the details were accurate, ensuring that everything was on record. But as the days turned into weeks, the weight of it all began to settle in. She wasn't just reliving the trauma of that night. She was reminding herself of everything that needed to change. It wasn't just about what had happened to her. It was about the system that allowed such things to happen in the first place. She hadn't expected things to change overnight. The reality was the system was built on years of policies and practices that were hard to shift. But she was determined to be a part of that change, no matter how long it took. The investigation moved slowly, but there were signs that it was being taken seriously. The officers involved were questioned thoroughly, and the department's internal affairs team was working to uncover any patterns of misconduct. It wasn't a quick process, but it was progress. She couldn't ask for more than that. One afternoon, she was called into a meeting with her superior, a seasoned officer who had been with the force for many years. He sat behind his desk, his face unreadable as she walked in. He motioned for her to sit, and she did, trying to steady herself. She had learned long ago not to jump to conclusions when it came to these meetings. In her line of work, nothing was ever truly as it seemed. "Thanks for coming in," he said, his voice steady but lacking warmth. "I wanted to follow up on the situation from a few weeks ago." She nodded, the memory of that night still fresh in her mind. "Of course. I'm ready to discuss whatever you need." "I've reviewed the report from Internal Affairs," he said, flipping through some papers on his desk. "The investigation is moving forward, and it looks like there's a clear case of misconduct. The officers involved have been placed under further scrutiny, and they're facing disciplinary action. However, there's still a long way to go." The words hit her like a wave. She had expected as much, but hearing it confirmed felt like a weight lifting off her shoulders. The officers involved would be held accountable. It was a small victory, but it was one that felt significant. "That's good to hear," she said, her voice steady. "But what about the larger issue? This isn't just about those two officers. It's about the entire system." Her superior gave her a long look, his expression unreadable. "I'm aware of the broader implications, but it's not always easy to make systemic changes, especially when you're dealing with a culture that's been in place for decades. It takes time." She nodded. She understood that. She wasn't naive enough to think that the system could be fixed overnight, but it didn't mean she had to stop trying. "I'm not asking for miracles," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I just want to make sure that this doesn't keep happening. I want to see real change." Her superior sat back in his chair, his eyes searching hers. "I understand. And I'll do everything in my power to make sure the department addresses these issues. We'll keep you informed as the investigation progresses." She nodded again, standing up to leave. As she walked out of the office, she felt a sense of cautious optimism. There was still a long way to go, but for the first time, she felt like the wheels of change were turning. Weeks passed, and the investigation continued. The officers involved were given the opportunity to explain their actions, but it became clear that their behavior wasn't just an isolated incident. There were patterns of discrimination, of racial profiling that had been overlooked for far too long. It wasn't just a matter of one bad decision, it was about a deeper issue within the department that had festered for years. The girl found herself speaking at more meetings, advocating for policy changes, pushing for better training and accountability. It was exhausting, but it was necessary. The more she spoke out, the more she realized how much of an uphill battle it was. Some of her colleagues supported her efforts, while others were hesitant, unsure of how far they were willing to go. She couldn't let their hesitation stop her. This was bigger than any individual. This was about the future of law enforcement, about ensuring that every person, no matter their race or background, was treated fairly and with respect. But there were moments when doubt crept in. There were times when she wondered if it was all worth it. Was this fight ever going to be won? Would she ever see the changes she was fighting for? It felt like progress was always just out of reach, a promise that was never fully realized. One evening, after another long day of meetings and phone calls, she found herself standing on the balcony of her apartment, looking out over the city. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the skyline. The world around her seemed so still, so calm. But inside she felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had fought hard for change, but there were days when it felt like she was fighting an impossible battle. But she couldn't give up. She couldn't let the system win. As the days passed, the department began to implement some of the changes she had advocated for. More comprehensive training on racial profiling and discrimination was introduced. New protocols were put in place for handling situations like the ones she had experienced. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. The two officers who had been involved in the incident were eventually dismissed from the force, their careers over. It was a small victory, but it sent a message to the rest of the department that actions had consequences. It wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done, but it was a step in the right direction. Months later, she stood in front of a room full of officers, speaking at a training session about racial profiling, about the importance of fairness and respect in law enforcement. It was a far cry from where she had been just a few months ago, when she had been the one facing discrimination. But she knew that this was the work that mattered. This was the work that would make a difference in the long run. When she finished speaking, there was a moment of silence in the room. Then one of the officers stood up and applauded. Slowly, others joined in. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was a sign that change was possible, that the fight was worth it. As she left the room, she felt a sense of accomplishment, a sense that the fight was far from over, but that it was heading in the right direction. She knew there would be setbacks and she knew the journey would be long. But she also knew that she had made a difference, and that was enough to keep pushing forward.